Ladies and gentlemen, the show we've all been waiting for, Paranormal Buzz Radio is proud to present REP Paranormal and Friends with your hosts, Kim Purvis and Allison Robinson. Live every Thursday night on Spreaker, 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central, 5 Pacific. Be sure to check out their Facebook page, REP Paranormal Busters.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast by the host or the guest do not necessarily reflect the views of Paranormal Buzz Radio or its sponsors. Use of any material produced by Paranormal Buzz Radio without express written consent is strictly prohibited. For information on everything Paranormal Buzz Radio has to offer, visit our website, paranormalbuzzradio.com. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Listener discretion is advised.
Everyone, welcome to another night of REP Paranormal and Friends. We have another awesome guest lined up for you tonight. She is an author, she likes to travel, and she loves pretty much everything creepy, strange, and bizarre from what I have gathered from looking at her website and some of the books she has written. So if everybody could welcome Varla Ventura to the show. How are you? Yes. That's awesome. So why don't you kind of give us a little bit of a background on yourself? How did you get interested in all these things? I mean, there's so many different things like fairies, mermaids, seances. You're kind of all over the place. How did you get interested in all these things? Mm-hmm.
So I was exposed to a lot of things in the world at a very young age, such as witchcraft, magical creatures, herbs, fairy lore. So I think that that sort of kind of colored my view of the world. And then as I became a teenager, I got more interested in things like tarot cards and seances and sort of that the paranormal side of things. And so, yeah, it's just kind of, I've always been interested in anything that sort of goes bump in the night, things that are kind of on the flip side. And so I just kind of, I was writing and trying to make ends meet, and someone suggested, hey, why don't you write a book about, something that you really like strange things. And so one of my first books, The Book of the Bizarre, was... Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It's freaky facts and strange stories. And I've come quite a long way since then, I think, in terms of writing style and kind of narrowing my topics down. But that book was actually it was successful enough that I conned my publisher into publishing like 5 more books with me. So,
hey, I would say that's pretty darn good. Oh my goodness. Yes. Cause I was looking through some of those. It's like, oh my gosh, I need to buy each one of these books. And just this winter, I just need to sit down and read them all, because just the topics on them and everything are so awesome. And I for one have always, when I was younger, I always thought there was mermaids in the lake across the street from me. Why? Ooh. I don't really know, but I've always thought that. And, so, and I've, some people believe that there are mermaids and things out there, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. Well, mermaids are particularly interesting because I think that in the world of sort of like in sort of the paranormal community, there'll be people who are they really believe in UFOs and Bigfoot, but they like just kind of think mermaids are not real. And which I find amusing because it's pretty hard to like really, delineate between one sort of fantastical, magical creature and another, and who's to say what's really the most plausible. But for whatever reason, I feel like mermaids are one of the most popular creatures, kind of that underworld or that flip world, but that they're not always equated with that or associated with that. So they're definitely considered part of, part of the fairy kingdom, part of the underworld, part of that other realm, and they have quite a dark side as well. But I think anytime you have water, so you have, mermaids most frequently seen in like the salty oceans, but there are a lot of inland lakes that have sightings of some kind of fish-like creature or some other kind of magical creature. And I think if you think about just from a very practical kind of maybe even more of a anthropological sense, anytime you have water, like water is sacred, right? We need water. Water sustains us. The ocean sustains us with food, and the inland lakes and streams sustain us. They keep plants alive. They keep us alive with the water. So we need water to survive. And so going back like since time immemorial, there are always protectors of the water and water spirits. And I think that depending on what culture you're looking at and what era, you will find examples of some kind of mermaid or water creature, whether it's at a well or out at sea.
Very interesting. So maybe you never know. There could have been a mermaid out here.
You just never know.
There could still be. I mean, there could be some kind of magical elemental out there that's like hanging around that lake that you're talking about. Actually, in my book, there's one of the stories. It's a fiction story, but it's an old story. It's called The Mermaid of Druid Lake, and it's actually from it's set in Baltimore, and it's this pretty hilarious story about this guy who walks up to a lake. He's walking through this Druid Lake park, and he sees this mermaid and just thinks she's like the most beautiful thing and wants to talk to her and starts talking to her. And she basically says, well, I'm trapped in this lake. And I think the story was written in like 1915 or something like that. So, he basically rigs up this kind of very early car that he borrows from a friend, and he fastens like a glass tank on it so he can pretty much take this mermaid on a joyride.
Oh my gosh.
So it's this pretty fantastic story where they get the mermaid up in there and then they're barreling along and then they lose, they kind of slip off the track and it tips over and the mermaid disappears into the river. But actually some of the it's absolutely hilarious story, but some of the earliest kind of ideas about mermaids do actually involve lakes, and that someone's going to a lake and they see this beautiful woman and end up like killing them, or they kill someone and they hide in the lake. There's a lot of variations on that. So yeah, and then mermaids themselves are just kind of a fascinating way of viewing sort of women and how we view women in folklore and culture as well. So I think that they, there's a lot to unpack with mermaids. A lot more than just, under the sea.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm pretty sure they don't look like Ariel.
Yeah. Right.
So I know you have a new book out, and I am pretty fascinated by this. So it's Paranormal Parlor: Ghosts, Seances, and Tales of True Hauntings.
Yeah.
So do you want to kind of tell us a little bit about what's in store for us in this book?
Sure. Now, I think that we can do a little meta work here because Joe Diamond actually has a story in here.
Oh, yes.
So he's how I found out about your podcast.
Yes, and he told us about you.
You had him on, and I don't,
Yes.
not sure if the episode is aired yet. So
Yes, it has. Yep.
Joe Diamond's fantastic.
Yes.
And actually, I met him because years ago he had a show, and he had me on his radio show back in the day.
Oh, cool.
So that's kind of how we got to know each other, and we actually met in real life. One of the few people that I've worked with over the years I've met in real life.
Oh, yeah, awesome.
Podcasting and radio and writing, it can be very like hole up in your cabin and get it done kind of work.
Right.
You actually always have to meet the people. So it's always a treat when you get to go to like those conventions and things where like-mindedness. So this book is, I love ghosts. I love ghost stories. So first of all, I wanted to kind of explore the art of the ghost story and the elements that make a ghost story more convincing and more compelling. So both in a traditional sense and in a modern sense. And you can't really explore the paranormal without talking about the spiritualist movement, in particular in the United States, which really took off, like 1840s through about the 1930s is when it was kind of really roiling in the U.S. and also in Canada and in the U.K. It was popular. It exists still and existed around the world, but once kind of had the Fox sisters out touting their wild knockings and things like that.
Right.
Got quite a movement there. And I find it particularly interesting, and this is probably it's a book in and of itself, but in my book it's just one chapter, of just kind of looking at some of the women in that spiritualist movement and how that spiritualist movement, which for anyone who isn't familiar with it, it essentially is the idea that not only can we make contact with the afterlife and the dead, but that they actually have messages for us. So it was sort of the original, I mean, we've consulted oracles since time immemorial, but oracles are associated with gods and other beings, whereas spiritualism really is looking for like somewhat spirit in the greater sense, but more specifically contact with, dead humans. Right. So out of that came, and sort of the idea of paranormal parlor is really kind of that place where in Victorian society, you went into the nice house on the corner and they would have the host the seance in their parlor. And it's an interesting time in history. And I think for women in particular, especially women of a certain class. So we're talking like, middle class white women primarily. There was, there were still so many confines for women in general in society, but for women of that sort of status, there weren't a lot of options with what you could do. You were basically expected to either marry well, inherit well, maybe be a school teacher, but then you'd only do that for a little while. And then, then you kind of had a couple of other choices. You could go, you could go the prostitution route, right? If you were from a semi-decent family, that wouldn't have been as available to you, and you probably wouldn't have had the training to go on stage and, be an opera singer. So, and women were also not published then. Women were still not widely published, and so frequently women were writing under male pen names in order to get published. And so there's this whole kind of subculture of sort of Victorian era writers and Edwardian era writers who were actually channeling materials and writing under pen names with the kind of, for lack of a better expression, sort of the gimmick or the shtick was that it wasn't them, it was a divine entity. So there was one woman in particular who was quite widely published. She wrote novels, and her name is Pearl Coran, but she wrote under the pen name Patience Worth. And Patience Worth was this divine angelic being that came to her and basically gave her poems and novels. And at one point she was considered a poet laureate. So she was really had quite a bit of success in her writing career with this idea that she had channeled everything.
Oh, wow.
She was that was all coming about in about 1915 or so in St. Louis, actually.
Oh, wow.
St. Louis was really a hotbed for a lot of spiritualist stuff. Yeah, interestingly. So a lot of cool parlors there.
Wow. Now, didn't Queen Victoria, didn't she take part in some of these things?
Yeah, so I mean, Queen Victoria had definitely kind of set the tone for a lot of the kind of mourning practices and things that we associate with the Victorian era. Mm-hmm. And I actually read, I believe it was Queen Victoria. She was one of the first queens who, I think she was the one who started brides wearing white. I don't think brides traditionally really wore white. A lot of women didn't have white clothing. White clothing wasn't practical. And I believe she got married in a white gown. And so that became that's why we, brides traditionally wear white. Probably more influential in the United States in particular was Mary Todd Lincoln.
Oh,
So she was having seances in the White House. They lost their son, right? He was like 11 or so.
Right.
And their son, Willie, I think his name was. And so she frequently would have a medium that she would talk with and that would help her communicate. And then she would occasionally host seances in the White House. And the other thing was that at the end of the Civil War, you saw a huge spike in the interest in spirit mediumship and spiritualism in general, because you had people who were mourning. They had lost loved ones that they didn't know, where they were. In some cases, they were buried on the other side of the country. And so you had people who were, just looking for some kind of sign or communication that, their son was at peace. So that, and then of course, simultaneously with all of that, you have the advent of some major technology, right? You're starting to get electric lights, and you're starting to get the telephone and the telegrams and things like that are really becoming more commonplace. And so, and the radio, disembodied voices coming in over the radio or over some kind of form of communication. So for many people today, we think of it like, oh, this was just the start of kind of a bunch of making things up, right? But and of course there were charlatans. The Fox sisters admitted to being charlatans.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, they did.
But you also had people that were, the way that you communicated then was you waited for a letter to arrive 3 weeks after the fact. And so to have a way to be able to communicate differently and believe that you were making contact was very appealing to people. You also had spirit photography and things like that, which people did. Most everyday people did not understand the concepts of photography beyond maybe the basics. And so spirit photography was definitely a place where I think a lot of trickery was taking place.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that's all part of kind of the beauty and interest of the entire movement itself and kind of how it evolved and the things that, there's just so many great stories. You've got women who were arrested for, their roles. You've got women who were kind of secretly successful. You also had a lot of crossover with abolitionists and suffragists. So you had the sort of open-minded spiritualists were right in there. And there was even one couple that they used to host. They used to have salons all the time in their parlor. And it was, I think it was Isaac and Amy Post, I believe were their names. And Isaac Post actually went on to be a pretty successful spirit medium himself. But they used to host salons, and they had Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. And they also had the Fox sisters. So there was definitely an interesting time for kind of the evolution of how we look at the afterlife during that time.
Yeah, I didn't know that I mean, there was another episode that we did. I can't remember if it was with Amanda Woomer or if it was with Penny. It might have been with Penny Griffiths Morgan. I can't remember. But we had talked about some of these things from the Victorian area and everything like that. Then we also talked about, I don't know if you've heard of this, but there was a man and woman who had gone to a funeral, and then like when they came home, I think it was, they had turned their TV on, and in the static they saw like the person that was deceased. Have you seen that?
No.
Gosh,
Like that must be obviously pretty recent then.
Oh, it was, I can't remember. It was when, I think it was just, with black and white TVs and things like that, and it had come on. But, gosh, I wish I could remember what that is, because you'd have to check that out. It's a little bizarre. I'm not sure, if how they could fake that one or not. But, I mean, that just kind of reminded me, because, you had trickery back then, you have trickery now. People still fake things and everything else. So it's been continued on from how many years ago up until now. It's been just kind of a trend, I think. But it's just interesting to hear that they were doing these things even way back then.
Well,
it just blows my mind.
And I think the reasoning too, like one of my favorite stories is actually, so the woman who was a poet laureate, who was channeling Patience Worth, Pearl Coran, was friends with this other woman. This woman was named Emily Grant Hutchings, and Emily actually was the person who kind of dragged Pearl to a seance. This was in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. You've got to meet this particular medium. She's just fantastic. And the story goes that at a seance that Emily attended, the medium was using a spirit board, what we know as a Ouija board.
Right.
She was using a spirit board, and she made contact with the Samuel Clemens, aka the ghost of Mark Twain.
Oh,
and he said to her, my scribe has arrived. And so, over the course of a year, Emily, her husband occasionally helped, and the medium all sat around a spirit board and basically used it as a psychic typewriter and transcribed an entire novel that was supposed to be the novel of a lot, the novel after death of Mark Twain. And it's this novel, it's called Jap Haron. And actually the kind of whole setup to it is probably a little more compelling than the novel itself. I've read it a couple times. It's got Twain vibes for sure. But the really kind of crazy other aspect of that is, okay, so not only did they channel this painstakingly from a Ouija board, or so they claim.
Right.
There are all these great things where they said that Twain's ghost was getting impatient because he would have a parenthetical phrase and he would have to sign out. He would have to kind of like move the planchet to say insert parentheses marks here. Oh. And so he had them draw. So they like took India ink and they painted on the Ouija board. So it had parentheses and semicolons and M dashes and all of the things that could be clear when you're writing. And so, and then there was another great line where she said he told them that she said, "Are there many of you there?" And he said, "Oh, yes. Everyone on this side wants to scribe on Earth." And I thought, oh my gosh, it was just such a Beetlejuicy kind of thought in my head of like all of these people kind of pushing through, wanting to be heard.
Right.
And so the thing is that the novel itself was written and it was picked up by a publisher and it was published, but Samuel Clemens' daughter and his publisher got wind of it. And what the mistake that they made really is that they said, I believe the title was Jap Haron, a novel written via Ouija, and then it said, it had a picture of Mark Twain, and it basically said Mark Twain in the title or the subtitle somewhere. Well, Mark Twain, which was a pen name,
right?
Copyright was held by his publisher.
Oh my gosh.
The daughter was the, all the profits went to the proceeds.
Right.
And so they sued the publisher and actually went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Oh my gosh.
Be proven whether or not they were not debating the existence of the afterlife. They were debating copyright infringement because they had claimed it was the ghost, that it was this deceased person. If they had said Samuel Clemens all along, they may not have they may have won. But by use of Mark Twain specifically, that was a copyright infringement, and copyright infringement is taken much more seriously than the Ouija board. And so they lost. The book was destroyed.
Oh my gosh.
That's why many of us have never read it or seen it. And I, to this day, have not seen a physical copy. And if I ever do, I'm going to probably sell my arm to get it.
Get it? Yeah.
I've never seen one, but what I have seen is on Gutenberg, which is a wonderful resource online of archived public domain works. There's a scanned version of it. So it's from an actual book. So a few of them survived. I'm sure they said destroy all the copies, and she kept a couple, and he kept a couple.
I'm sure. Yes. Oh my gosh, that's insane.
But I just love that story. And then the other kind of interesting part of that is that, and then this is pure speculation on my part.
Yeah.
Moderate amount of research, and I would have to dig deeper to really kind of prove this. But so they were friends, and Emily's book came out, I think, in 1917. By then, Pearl, aka Patience, had already had a number of successes. And Emily was there. There's also evidence to suggest that she was in correspondence. There's a couple of letters that she wrote to Mark Twain, to Samuel Clemens, to ask him about writing. And so I think she was kind of a struggling writer too. So there's also this fantastic element of what would you do?
Oh yeah.
Published, would you contact the afterlife? Would you? And so we don't know. Is this the world's greatest publicity stunt? Did they make the typewriter and think they were making contact? I don't know, but the story itself is it's set up in this way that is believably fantastic. And, so, you kind of wonder, she saw her friend's success. Did that encourage her to take that path? So
really
interesting, especially again, for women of that era, what choices did you really have? Unless you had a lot of money and you could sort of be like a wealthy spinster, you were you had some pretty serious confines, physically and in every way. Not only were you stuck in a corset, but you were
exactly
allowed to do a lot of thinking or talking or expressing.
Anything. Pretty much anything.
Pretty much anything.
Okay. All right, let's see here. I know that you had talked a little bit. You have a little bit of an insert in your book about Joe. Was it about a haunted tarot deck?
Yeah. So what the other thing I did with this book is I was kind of collecting. I always like to include stories that people have sent me, or interview people and include those in my book. So I have a couple in the mermaid book. Actually, I have an interview with a mermaid crusader, and then a couple of people sent me their mermaid encounters. So there's some cool stuff in there. So for this book, I wanted to do that, and I kind of just approached a few people that I had worked with. I'd been on their shows, or I knew they were into the general paranormal. And no one understands the paranormal parlor like Joe Diamond. He really, really got it. He got it immediately. He was like, I know exactly, it's like I felt like he knew exactly what the table looked like when we walked in the room. So I asked him if he had a story. And the other really cool thing, it was kind of the magical thing about the book, is that initially I thought I'm going to have a chapter about my ghost stories. I'm going to have a chapter about other people's ghost stories. I had this idea. And as I started writing, I really found that for my personal stories, as I was trying to kind of create each topic for each chapter, my own personal experiences were kind of coming through more organically that way. So instead of saying here's all my haunted experiences ever up until this point, and this time I stayed in a haunted hotel, when I did the chapter about haunted hotels, I wanted to tell a couple prominent experiences I had had.
Right.
And so I was asking people for contributions, thinking they were all going to go in one chapter. And what was sent to me were stories that actually kind of magically went into the different chapters, with unknown to the people who were sending them to me, and completely unknown to me because I had no idea what people were going to send. Right. And so Joe's story, it's a pretty fantastic story where basically he goes to visit a friend, and she gives him a deck, a tarot deck. And I think, if I remember right, it's a deck that, let's see, it's in chapter 3. It's a deck that he's that the friend is kind of like, I don't really want this deck so much. I think it had been inherited in her family, and she just was like not liking the vibes of it. And Joe was like, I'll take it. And so it's a complete deck. Oh, or was it his deck? Now Joe's gonna like, so you got my story wrong. I wrote it down. Let's just flip to it, okay? Why am I okay? So we're gonna go straight to Joe's story here. Okay, so it's the case of the haunted tarot deck. So it's his dear friend Angel, with whom he visits in Florida regularly. And then I did get it right. She has a tarot deck that belongs to her family, but its origins are unknown. It's been around for multiple generations, and her family lore says something about it belonging to an aunt, but no one really knows for sure. Angel has a few decks and reads the tarot, but for whatever reason, this particular deck she inherited has always made her feel uneasy. So she's moving, he's visiting, and she decides, I want to just get rid of this deck. I don't want to take it with me. So she gives it to him. So, and actually he says, naturally, I volunteered to take this odd deck off of her hands. So when he arrives for his visit, she greets him with the deck. She said, since I was serious, she said, I should take it now and get it out of her house. So he takes it and he puts it in his car, and he kind of slips it in one of the pockets of his, behind the seat. A couple of other little items, journal for jotting things down, but nothing else in there. So then he visits for about a week, and then the deck basically never leaves his car. He just leaves it in there, goes and he visits, and then he's driving. He's about 2 hours away, and the friend calls him while he's on the road and says, real funny, Joe. I have no idea what she's talking about, and tell her as much. The deck, Joe, on the bed, very funny. I insist I don't know what, I being Joe, I insist I don't know what she means, and then she explains to me that when she went into the room to change the sheets, she found the tarot deck there on the bed.
Oh my gosh.
She called me right away. I, on the other hand, hadn't thought much about the deck and hadn't touched it since I'd put it in my car that first day. Oh. Okay. Actually, it gets even weirder because he's traveling and right now he doesn't travel as much, but typically he travels to and fro to do shows and things like that at a few different places. And, he kind of just he freaked that pocket in his car is where the deck had been, which wasn't there anymore. He keeps particular things in there, maybe a book. Like if he pulls over and he gets to a show early and he's sitting in the parking lot, pulls the notebook out and makes notes in it. So he actually cleans his car out and knows pretty much always what's in there. Right. So it's a year later. He's making a plan to go back to see Angel in Florida. And he's actually cleaning out his car, and he goes into that backseat pocket and he finds a single card from that deck, the Knight of Cups. So thereby not only proving that it was in his car at some point, right? He hadn't found this deck. So he called Angel. He asked her to describe the deck. She described it to him, and she looked through it. And of course, there was one missing card, and that was the Knight of Cups. And then when he finally gets to her, she can't find the deck. She actually cannot find the deck anywhere, even though they had it recently because she was confirming it. Right. And then he said, before he shared this story, I called Angel to make sure she was okay with me sharing it, and asked her, please tell me if this was just some kind of elaborate prank. And she swears it's not. And we still don't know how or where the deck went to, but that was a wonderful story of the haunted tarot deck. I just wondered, how can that be?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So
that's a little bizarre. And they still haven't found it?
As of the last time, I think Joe told me if they ever find it, he will call me and give me the follow-up to it. So
okay, all right.
So this is now 2000 and what year are we? 21.
Yes.
Okay, so it's more than or it's almost 10 years later, and
my gosh, still no deck. Oh my gosh, that's insane! Like, that's really weird. How it was in his car, leaves one card. Is there like a symbolic thing meant for him for that card?
I know that's card? What I said, and I think he did tell me that Knight of Cups is actually a card that comes up for him occasionally anyway, which is kind of makes sense if you've ever met the guy and you know anything about the tarot.
Right.
Cups are sort of, very, very much heart and love and emotion. He's a very, very positive, warm person, and certainly a knight in his own right. So
yeah. So that does make sense. But yeah, I was just thinking that, I'm like, does it have some kind of symbolic thing for him? Why they left that card for him, that specific one?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I actually need to call him up and ask him if he's had any more weird Taronis lately, because in the last, this we could ask anyone who's listening who does pull tarot. I've learned the tarot when I was probably same age I learned to play gin rummy, like 8 or 9 years old. So I'm not by any means I don't consider myself a psychic medium. I don't really read for other people, but I can kind of, I can read a deck, and I have several decks. I used to actually only have one deck. For years, I only had one deck, and I would look at other decks and I absolutely couldn't read them. It was like they were written in a language I didn't understand. And then I was given actually a really amazing deck by my mother, whom she got from a hermit who lived up the road. And it's the first edition Thoth Tarot that he kept buried underground for years, literally buried underground.
Oh my gosh.
So a lot of people think, I don't want to use a used, they won't use like a used tarot deck. Well, let me tell you, this was and I've seen that deck for years, and actually worked with a couple of authors on some books that were specifically about that deck. And I've never really had a great connection with it. But when she handed me this deck that had been buried in the earth for 6 years or something, I thought, well, this one's ready to talk.
Exactly.
In any case, I have had, for the last 2 to 3 months, I don't want to call it alarming, but certainly a noticeable spike in synchronicity across decks and cards I've pulled. And so I'm curious, I've been meaning to ask Joe if he's had any kind of weird card or tarot stuff lately. But I one time I have 4 decks that I'll pull from, and I'll just pull like one card from each. Yeah. And didn't happen today, but it has happened multiple times where 3 of the 4 cards will be the same, or I'll have 2 and 2, or I'll have 3 and 1, and then the next day I'll get 2, or I'll get 3 and 1 of the former one, if that makes any sense. Like it'll be a different deck.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe other people out there are having some kind of like tarot synchronicity. Not sure.
That I don't know.
Not sure what to make of it. Guess someone's like trying to make sure their point is across. And so far they've been cool cards too. It's like usually the major arcana, and so those are nice because those are a lot easier to read. It's like, oh, the magician, yay! I got that 3 times. It's like winning. I won.
Oh my goodness. Okay, let's see here. I know we're getting a few questions here in chat, so I want to try to get some of those answered for the listeners here.
Great.
Oh yeah, a few. All right. So let's see what their first question is here. This one's actually about fairies. So,
great.
Darren would like to know, what can fairies do for us?
Well, perhaps the better question is, what can we do for the fairies?
Yes.
Well, fairies they have a long-standing reputation of sort of holding things in balance.
Mm-hmm.
And they are protectors of animals and children. So that's one thing that fairies are known for.
Mm-hmm.
For the most part, as far as adult relationships with fairies go, I think it's really important to remember that fairies like to be acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
So they like offerings. It's really important if you want to connect with any kind of fairy type being that you make an offering.
Mm-hmm.
And that offering frequently can be very simple. If it's something that you're trying to attract to your garden, you can create a little space. You can leave some beautiful shiny things. They like, skeleton keys and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something that you're trying to attract more domestically to kind of help you in your home, leaving out wine, cakes, oat cakes are really popular. You can leave out a saucer of milk. So there's one kind of fairy in particular that's kind of more of a domestic fairy.
Mm-hmm.
So in some, I believe in Scotland they're called brownies. In Wales they call, actually in Scotland they're called dobies, aka Dobby. They're more like house spirits. And then in Wales they're called brownies. And then kind of it's one of those things that there's a lot of different names for, and a lot of them have a similar root word in Gaelic, but they are all sort of like hobgoblins, and they're domestic kind of. They will come and actually enter your home and live in your home, and will help kind of maintain balance. Sometimes they take little things here and there, but they are more or less there to protect, to keep the animals safe and to kind of keep your house in order. But if you're super lazy and like never clean your own kitchen, then they get mad, and you never give them any kind of thanks, then they get mad. But the fairy kingdom is such a vast, it's hard to give one answer of like, what can the fairies do for us? Because I look at the fairy kingdom the way you might look at the plant kingdom, right? So there's like, okay, plants. That's the big one, right? But underneath that, there are all these classifications. You have trickster fairies. You have fairies that are protectors. You have fairies that are kind of not so good. You have fairies that warn, that snatch babies. You have fairies that warn of death. You have things that kind of exist just to terrify you. But all of these creatures do have a role, just as in the forest. The poisonous plants are actually protecting something. They might be protecting another plant that can't thrive as much, or they're protecting a certain part. They could be protecting like a delicate area of the forest where they don't want you to go and traipse about. So there's a lot of kind of reasons that we need the fairy. And if you think of it like the fair, I like to think of the fairy ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I think that they can bring us a lot of wisdom and actually a lot of understanding of the afterlife and the underworld, because in traditional Celtic belief it's the same thing. The underworld, the afterlife, that is the kingdom of the fairy, and it's not a world that just exists in and of itself. And the floodgates do open. They kind of move the stone out from in front of the cave on Samhain, on Halloween, but you still have this existence all the time. And there are just countless stories of, just trickery, funny things that happen, just reminders. But a lot of people will kind of keep fairies at an arm's length. It's sort of a healthy respect, like you might with a poisonous bug or something. I was like, okay, you stay over there, and I'll just stay in my lane.
Right. So. Yes. Yes, exactly. I didn't realize there was so many different fairies. It's like almost everything comes from a fairy or is some type of fairy. Like those, aren't they, what is it called? Like the changelings? Aren't they the ones that take the babies?
Those are the freakiest ones of them all. Yes. They are they're the kidnappers of the fairy kingdom. Yes. And they'll swap a fairy baby for, they'll take the human baby and swap in a fairy baby. So they're pretty creepy. The other, mermaids are actually, the Murrow are considered part of that kingdom, which, they're their own kind of, there's so many amazing stories about that, as we mentioned, and just the idea of water spirits and fairies that protect water. But they're also considered part of the fairy kingdom. And actually, believe it or not, the fairy that kind of surprised me the most was the leprechaun.
Oh yeah. I didn't realize that either when I was looking that up. It's like, what?
Yeah. Well, and they're much more complex than we give them credit for. So I think I had, like everyone, the sort of, Darby O'Gill view of the leprechaun, or the Lucky Charms, the idea of, like, the end of the rainbow and the person like a green bowler hat. Right. But in fact, there are a lot of stories describing them with very specific details. In fact, William Butler Yeats has one of the best descriptions of leprechauns, or what are also known as claricons. And first of all, they're cobblers. So they were the cobblers of the fairy kingdom. And you could often hear them if you were still enough in the forest. You could hear the knock, knock, knocking, and you could kind of follow that to try and find where the leprechaun was. They love fabrics, especially really nice silks and velvet fabrics. So you can, like, make offerings to them, but they love to dress very nicely. And they tend to live, they're very solitary. Usually I don't know if you could really say male, female, but they're usually considered male, and kind of the bachelors that live alone in the forest.
Yes.
And the whole idea of the end of the rainbow, they actually don't have a pot of gold. They have a magic purse. Well, there might be a pot of gold that they keep stored away, but they have a magic purse, and that magic purse can have, infinite coins or no coins at all.
Right.
And so it's pretty funny, because frequently you'll read these stories, and for whatever reason, there's a whole slew of stories where someone catches a leprechaun and they try to torture it into telling the person where the goods are.
Right.
And I think that's where the idea of the end of the rainbow comes from, because it's not obtainable. It's a refraction of light. You will never get to the end of the rainbow.
Exactly.
And so there's a certain element of, like, an allegory about greed in there, and about trying to, like, that get rich quick
scheme. Yep.
Yeah, but I have a couple of great stories that I couldn't help but include, including one where a guy outsmarts the leprechaun, or thinks he does, and he gets the purse, and it's back, the leprechaun has outsmarted him. The leprechaun goes back, on his merry way, and the guy goes down to the pub and insists on buying everybody a drink with all this new golden store that he has. And when he reaches in, he pulls out the single golden coin. And what the leprechaun tells him is, you can have my purse. There's always one gold coin in it. So as soon as you take one out, there'll be another one. Oh, okay. That sounds great. So he goes down to the pub and, drinks on me, pulls the coin out, sets it down on the bar. And the bartender is like, that's not enough. And you're like, 5 more of those. And he reaches in and it's empty. So and then he has to scrub pots or something to,
my God.
And everybody laughs at him. And so the role that the leprechaun also plays in storytelling is pretty clever. But they're definitely, like, there's more to them. They're not always in green. In fact, the idea of the leprechaun, if you think of how we might view what a leprechaun looks like today, we're really looking at is what an Irish immigrant looked like, a well-to-do, dapper citizen that immigrated to the United States circa 1890 or so, looked more like that, with the bowler hat and the watch and the vest and all of that. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Cause I was looking up leprechauns and things when we did some folklore stuff, and I didn't realize that they were part of the fairy. Like, almost everything I research, it seems like they've got something to do with fairies.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting too, because I think that even the word goblin and cobbler, there's an overlap there. And I think especially one of my great resources that I absolutely love for any kind of folklore, and it's thick as can be, but it's a book called British Goblins, and it's by a man named William Wirt Sykes, and he was actually a consulate general to Wales. I believe he was American. He was the consulate general in Wales in, I think from like 1880 till like 1900 or so. And he spent a lot of time collecting folk tales, much in the way Yeats did in Ireland, and the Grimm brothers did in parts of Europe and Eastern Europe. And so he it's just this amazing collection of customs. He really had quite a reverence for the Welsh customs, and they were very different, and there were still a lot of, quote unquote old ways in practice. So he's got a whole chapter just about funeral practices, common funeral practices in the countryside or in the towns. And so you have, and he talks a lot about the words and the etymology, and of course Welsh, Scottish, and Irish are all the same. They come from the Gaelic, and so there are certain root words. It's not the same language, but there's a similarity in some of those words, especially when talking about the little, the creatures. And so you've got goblins and cobblers, and then of course you get into like the leprechaun actually took me down the Tommyknocker road because I thought, that tapping is another way, and then it got me into like the whole idea of the Tommyknockers and the guardians that kind of dwelled in the earth and are friend or foe to the miners and let them know about cave-ins and things like that. And again, you're supposed to leave offerings. You can't just take it all. Well, that also makes sense. You can't you take out too much and everything collapses. So there's another little allegory in there as well. So
it's just very interesting. Huh? None? Oh, I thought you were saying something, Kim. I thought she was going to speak. Okay, let's see here. We do have another question here. This kind of goes with the fairy things. It's another one from Darren. He wants to know, what is the most notorious fairy out there?
Ooh, the most notorious fairy. So I think one of the most okay, I'm gonna give you two answers. The banshee is probably the most feared fairy because the banshee, which often appears as like a harmless little woman walking down the road or something somewhat beautiful that then turns horrific as it screams, is particularly dangerous. The banshee itself isn't inherently evil and doesn't necessarily cause death, although it can, a little madness can occur sometimes, but it portends death. And so to hear the banshee scream or see a banshee means that someone that you know, and probably someone that you're very close to and love, will die. So that's pretty notorious. And then the other one that I'm a big fan of is the puka. Some people refer to fairies in general as pukas. I've heard that happen. I've actually heard a few people in Ireland just kind of refer to all fairies as pukas. There's a variety of spellings for it, but the puka is a shapeshifter, so really, really fascinating, often appearing as a rabbit or a horse.
Yes, I did read that.
The horse usually has like glowing red eyes. And the puka is really all about kind of shaking you up on your path. So, the puka tends to prey on drunks or people who might not be believed by society for whatever reason. They're less credible. But I think the puka often, like a lot of the stories are, you were stayed too late at the pub and you're walking out, it's too dark and you should have been home hours ago, and the puka comes along and kind of throws you onto its back and takes you on this ride across the fields where you're right next to the cliffs and you're sure you're going to die, and kind of literally scares you almost to death. And then you kind of wake up the next day thinking, okay, I'm going to get back on the straight and narrow now.
Yeah, right.
So
yes.
I think there's a level of terror with the pukas that is something that we probably, benefit from.
Yes.
As a society as a whole.
Yes. We can all use a little bit of being scared straight, I think, from time to time.
Right?
Maybe the kids. Tell your kids.
Yeah.
If you don't get on the straight and narrow, then we're going to send a puka at you, and they're going to scare you onto the straight and narrow. I need to use that. Especially with my youngest one.
Oh, sure. It's funny because I've actually had a number of parents tell me about, like, especially around Christmas time, sort of like traditions that they've created, and creatures that they've created that, you know, I mean, just that terrifying elf on the shelf thing.
Oh, yes.
That thing that you have to keep moving. And
right.
We got rid of ours immediately before my son.
I never did it.
No, it's just like, every parent I know that does it, they're just like so committed to it. And it's kind of like when someone gets a puppy and they're like, yeah, it's really cute. And he tears everything apart.
Right.
You know, it's like, oh yeah, the elf on the shelf. My kids love it with that, like, sort of like, you know, grimace.
Yeah. Yes. Nope. I never got into the elf on the shelf, and I'm glad I didn't, because that is just too much work for me.
Slippery slope, you know?
Yeah, yes, exactly. All right, let's see here. We have time for one more question here. So this one's kind of more about paranormal. They'd like to know, have you ever been on an investigation?
So I've been on a few kind of less formal investigations. I've never really, I mean, yes, I guess I have. I mean, I've been out with groups with EVP equipment and things like that. But the most powerful experiences I've ever had have been not on an investigation and not necessarily on a ghost tour at all, but exploring a place that might be known to be haunted, or staying in a hotel that was haunted, but not necessarily seeking those things. And I think, however, we did do an investigation, like an overnight at Preston Castle in Ione, California, which is really cool. It's so creepy. It looks like a creepy version of Hogwarts. It looks like Hogwarts.
Oh my gosh!
Up on top of this hill, this old brick castle, and it's you know, when we went, the top floors weren't restored, and so there were owls and bats flitting about in and out of the top floor and the rafters. I mean, it was seriously like you're just standing there going, "Is this real? This is amazing!" And my sister had her hair pulled when we were in the infirmary. I did. See, that's just to tell you, just to go full circle. I did it with two of my sisters and my mom. So that's just so you understand our family. It's a family thing to go to cemeteries and ghost tours.
There you go.
Yeah. And so she had her hair pulled, and I caught a lot of interesting things on camera later. I didn't have a lot of feelings except for in two places. One of them was the pool, where they used to dip the children basically in like bleach water.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. And then the other was my other sister had like a total breakdown in the shower room where they used to like make all the kids shower where they could. So what it was Preston Castle was a sort of like a boys' reformatory, but also ended up during the Depression era being a place that very poor families would just drop their sons off. And so you had sons from, you know, you had boys from like 10 to 21, and some of them were quote unquote juvenile delinquents, probably stole bread, and others were just their families couldn't afford to feed them. So there was a definite like looming sadness about the place as well. And of course, you know, we're all mothers, so that really amplified it for us, I think, in those places.
Yeah.
We felt like the pain. So, yeah.
I can agree with that. There's some places that we go to that I'll get a little emotional with and things like that. If there's been kids and things like that, it's just sad, especially like the Villisca Axe Murder House. That place.
You just walk in and you feel the sadness.
Yeah, you feel.
Just because you know the history of it and everything, and it's already going through your head.
Yeah.
And it just sort of weighs on it's like your chest feels heavy and you're just like, oh, this is hard.
Yeah. Very much. Very much. Okay, so Darren has asked us, I almost forgot. This is a running question he asks on every podcast.
Oh, okay.
So he's like, please don't forget. And I'm like, I almost forgot. So, okay, so what is the one object in this world that you would not want to be haunted?
What is the one object I would not, probably don't want my computer to be haunted, to be honest. I write so much on it, although I have my own suspicions. What wouldn't I want to be haunted? Yeah, I feel like it probably would have to be an electronic device that I don't know enough about how to fix.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's true.
That's such a boring, I should have said something really cool, like, my grandmother's necklace, but honestly, I can't think of too many things that would bother me. I don't really want my car to be haunted.
That's what I picked.
Yeah. I rely so much on my computer to, that's where all my manuscripts are and all my ideas are, although I write out generally in longhand first. I don't type entire manuscripts long,
Right.
So if my computer was haunted and something happened to it, now, I'll just back that up by saying when I was working on that fairy book, I was working on the entire section about tricksters and hobgoblins.
Uh-huh.
I woke up the next day and I came, and granted it was late and I was way past my deadline, like 2 days past my deadline, and pretty stressed. It was like 2 a.m. I finally went to bed. I came back and that entire section was gone.
Oh!
Could have been
my
Fairies not liking how I represented them. Could have been very tired Varla, copying and pasting in the wrong spot, but...
Right. Oh, my gosh. Oh, I'd be so sick to my stomach. Luckily, it wasn't like a whole book or something.
No, one of the things I do is I write in chapters and I actually store the chapters separately and then put them into a manuscript. And I have talked to many, many authors, and that's also what they do because... there have been too many times that something's gone wrong with the greater manuscript. So if you keep it in sections until the end, then it's slightly safer.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Slightly safer.
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't you...
That's a great running question.
Yes.
Jared.
He asks everybody, and he keeps a tab to see what's the number one answer. What is the number one answer?
I'm not really for sure.
I think it might be a toilet. I'm not sure.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a time when you want to be relaxed. That's true. You don't want to have to worry about something grabbing you or pinching you.
Exactly.
I remember one, they had garbage disposal.
Oh, yeah. Garbage disposal was another one, too. Yeah, that wouldn't be...
Darren says toilet, yep.
Yeah, toilet is the number one.
I feel so happy knowing that.
Okay, so where can everybody purchase your books, and where can they find you if they want to follow you, find out what you're doing next?
Yes, you can visit. I have a website. It's varlaventura.net. And let's see, that's right. I have links to all my books. My books are available anywhere books are sold. So you can find them at your local bookstore, bookshop, IndieBound, Amazon, all of those places. They should all be in print still, believe it or not. And then I'm a little neglectful of keeping my events and things up to date on my website. So frequently I'll do that on Facebook. And then, occasionally I put weird pictures up on Instagram. So it's all my name. All you have to do is find Varla Ventura. I believe I am the only one.
Okay, perfect. All right. We'll share your information on our social media too, so everybody will be able to find you a little bit easier and get copies of your books. And I just want to give quick shout outs to everybody who was in chat tonight. I know we have several that weren't in chat, but are listening. They're always listening. But the ones that were in chat tonight, we had Matt, Darren, Shay, Kim. We had myself, we had Allie, and we had Eye of the Beholder. So thank you for joining us in chat. Thank you for everybody who was not in chat but listening. We appreciate each and every one of you. We'd like to thank our awesome guest tonight, Varla Ventura. Oh my gosh, it was so awesome. I mean, there's like a whole bunch more stuff we could have talked about tonight. All this kind of stuff, I love it. I love learning more and more.
We'll just have to have her on again.
I know. We'll have to have her on again.
Sounds good to me.
And then maybe we could have Joe help us co-host or something. He said he would love to co-host, so that would be
amazing.
That would be a great one to do. And so next week we are having Gina and Victoria from Haunted History BC. They're going to be on talking about some of their investigations, and we're going to talk about some bloopers and some interesting, fun, crazy things that have happened to them on their investigations. So stay tuned for that. And once again, thank you, Varla, for being on, and everyone have a good night, and we will be back next Thursday.
Thank you for listening to REP Paranormal and Friends. Be sure to check out Kim and Allison on Facebook at REP Paranormal Busters.